plan that I see in China at the moment is not unusual. There's 7 or 8 big ones. Like, for example, the World Economic Forum had the Great Reset. That's a plan of a similar scale. You will own nothing. You will have no privacy, and you'll be happy. It's the same basic idea as a relatively small group of people will control everything, not just in one little region, but most of the planet. Right? There have been lots of plans like this right across history, so they're actually not that unusual. What I see sort of happening is we may have a multipolar world for a while. If China is successful, it may be multipolar, but China will be the ultimate top of the food chain, and everyone else will dance to their tune because they control the economic and industrial infrastructure. Right? Especially if they're able to launch a currency that's backed with gold. Right. So I'm working in mineral intelligence, which is the idea is to track patterns in the data industry. Now, China dominates the system at large, and I know this from the Australian mining industry. The one client is China. We send all our concentrate to China, so it's known. But I came to Europe, and people didn't they sort of knew that, but they didn't want to look at it. Anyway, so I've been reading a series of books, like that one there. Where is it? Yeah. In 1999, a couple of Chinese colonels published this book. 1989 was a turning point. The Tiananmen Square massacre was a turning point, and the Hawks took control of the system. What has been happening all this time is what's called the 100-year marathon. I'm reading a book called The 100-Year Marathon at the moment, and they put forward the thesis from a military intelligence point of view, like the Pentagon and what have you. He was one of those guys, one of those analysts, and he said over the last couple of decades, the American intelligence infrastructure was convinced that the Chinese system, they're not very good, they're not very efficient, they've got corruption problems, they need a lot of help, they need development, they need investment, and if you help us, we're going to screw the Russians. Right, so it turns out that when Mao Zedong took power in 1949, they had a 100-year plan when China would become the preeminent culture in the world and take their place once more, like they used to be. And they studied the American system very carefully. For example, how did America surpass Great Britain and Europe? And it had a very frank look, and things like the Americans stole a lot of technology from the Europeans, and there was a bit of dodgy behavior in it. And the Chinese were very comfortable with that. The era of the warring states culture was there, and so
what did America steal? What did America steal from Europe?
Technology like textile technology, energy generation, industrialization.
How did they steal it?
Industrial espionage. Private companies, not America the country, but American businessmen would take an idea, and they would get rich because of it. How to build a better steam engine, how to build a better railway, how to build a better telecom switching board. Like Spain had the best switching board in the world, telecom switching, and an American entrepreneur, that looks interesting, and it was gone. And what we call capitalism. But there was a lot of there was a bit of fast and loose behavior in there. And so the Chinese studied all this. And at the same time, this is Mao Zedong back in the 1920s, they were studying very carefully how does one economy eclipse another. And they studied things like Charles Darwin, Darwinism, and they applied those basic concepts to the economy. And unfortunately, they mistranslated one of the concepts. Instead of survival of the fittest, they came up with a translation of the word elimination. So the strongest will devour the weakest. And if they're not the strongest, someone else will devour them. So reading a few of the classics of say Chinese strategy, And it turns out the art of war is the Boy Scouts' polite version of military strategy. In the Book of the Bastard, where there are no rules, what happens? So I've been studying the Chinese plan, and they believe that true power is economic, not military. Right, and so that they plan to be the next industrial superpower, but it's not military; it is economic. And so they are slowly taking over the system like a game of Go. They'll take over territory. They'll encircle the enemy, and but they'll do it in a softly fashion. We're not threatening. We're not threatening. We're not going to hurt you. We're not going to hurt you. And then when they're ready, they'll strike like thunder. The veil lifts, and it's all done. Right, that's their plan. Now, this is what has happened with the American intelligence operatives over the last 50 years. And when a few people started comparing notes, what they realized is these analysts were sort of manipulated. They were invited into China. Certain things were told to them in a certain order that turned out to be not quite correct. I'm of the opinion that the same thing is happening in the industrial sector. And so I'm now looking, I work in what's called mineral intelligence, and we're chasing what's called critical raw materials. There's a list. I'm convinced now that we've been asked to look at the wrong things. If I may share. Entire screen. What about the window? Share. Okay, can you see this?
Yep.
All right. So this is the basic idea of asking where are ideas coming from, and in terms of every group, every nation state in the world is looking at mineral intelligence, but we're all looking at each other. We're getting our ideas from each other. No one's having an original idea themselves. So I looked at the idea of what are we really chasing? Like, so the goal. There's the book called The Goal, which is the theory of operational theory of constraints, and they're looking at where is the bottleneck, and the goal is to make money. And so what if we change the goal to something else? It's not about money, it's about something else, the metals themselves. And so what are we really wanting to know, and where's the real bottleneck? And then there's industrial ecology, which is now what we call the circular economy. How do the moving parts fit together? And so I read these books. The 100-Year Marathon was probably the best one to start with. And so China controls the majority of the system. Their goal, the long-term full-spectrum global domination through control of the industrial value chain by 2049, 100 years after Mao Zedong took power in 1949. Between heaven and earth, everything industrial will be under Chinese control. So that's what they're planning. Right, so what I put together was this. So this pie chart is what raw materials went into manufacture in 2022. They've got us fixating on rare earth elements, which is 0.0003% of that. Most of it's steel, followed by aluminium and copper. Now, okay, they say rare earth elements do control stuff. But if we don't have steel, or aluminium, or copper, we also don't have stuff. They've taken control of the basic stuff. So this is the Chinese share. This is the things that go around. And I draw your attention to the ones in yellow, where they've got a little bit of mining on their own territory, but they've got control of the metal production. Now, anything over 30% is sort of what's classed as sort of like a monopoly share. They can dictate terms to the rest of the market.
So they have a 68% share of, what is that, pig iron smelting.
Yeah.
54% in raw steel production worldwide comes from China. And steel is a huge, is 65% of that feedstock.
And so here's aluminium. 58% of actual aluminium comes from China. Copper refinery production and everything. So what I'm saying here is what we are convinced to chase is rare earth elements to the point where, yeah, they're important, but we're not looking at everything else. And we've been encouraged to look at mining. Right. So let me show you these numbers. So let me just get rid of this. Okay. Okay, so the colors here, each of these countries have what's called a critical raw materials list, things that are strategically important. And so USA, Europe, China, India, Japan, Korea, UK, Australia, and Canada. And we've now got Russia on there as well. Okay, and so if it's on the color there, it's on the list. The table is it being produced in China? Yes. In black, we are seeing mining. So this is mining of a mineral. But what is blue is the metal production, right? So they're controlling. So aluminium production, 58% of the global share. So we go down. Copper refinery, 43% of the global share is controlled in China territory. Magnesium production, metal magnesium, 89%. They do control mining as well, like 86% of mercury and 70% of rare earth oxide in general. But things like silicon metal production, that you make silicon wafers for solar panels, 78%. Tin smelters, 42%. Titanium, 53%. Tungsten, 676. So on average, they've got 43% of mining and smelting globally. So then we go to industrial minerals, and this is all the stuff that's not that sexy, but we all need it, and we see the same problem. Cement. Do you know there's more concrete being poured in China, in Chinese territory, than the rest of the world combined? Now, cement and concrete is a proxy for industrialization. They are building like there's no tomorrow, and they've been doing it for decades. They are eclipsing us.
And
so,
how recent is this data from?
This is the data for the year 2022.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that kind of makes sense. If you go to China, you'll notice all of these ghost cities, they'll call them. I mean, they really did go, balls deep, and pardon the language, and trying to industrialize the entire country.
A lot of things haven't worked out the way they thought, but they've had a plan. So 32%. Remember, anything more than 30% is a controlling stake to the point where they can dictate terms. Fertilizer. So this is the production of fertilizer. So between Russia, Ukraine, China's got most of the rest. Energy. So in terms of oil extraction, they're a fraction, but they're consuming a lot. They've got a massive chunk of the coal mining industry, though. Precious metals, they've got a proportion amount to everyone else, but they sort of see it as they see gold as a critical element. Right. So what I then went off and did and said, all right, this is the animation problem. Sorry about this.
Yeah, well, let's expand a little bit on gold. Why is gold a critical element for China? Is this more like why do you anticipate that the case?
So this is the critical raw element lists for all of these countries. Right. So these countries, who considers what is critical, and China is red. And so when we get down to this is industrialization. So here we go. This is fertilizer. So and this is energy. China is the only country that takes energy seriously. Everyone else says, well, maybe a bit of uranium because they got nuclear and everything like that. Europe had coal in there, but they don't do smelting anymore, and they're phasing out coal. But China makes stuff. China does stuff, and they believe energy is vitally important.
Man, so I mean, you look at that chart you have up there, and it really shines a light. Like, it really does appear, like you said, like China is the only serious country, like especially compared to the West. Like the West is a collection of non-serious countries.
Yeah, but so there is an element of our own hubris and everything, but we've also been convinced to, we've been encouraged to go in a particular direction. We are encouraged to think about certain things, and we are directed away from other ideas internally. I'm not saying the Chinese are doing this. We are telling ourselves to do this. there is a groupthink in Europe in particular at the moment, which I think is quite destructive. But here's the outcome. China is looking at things really because they are actually producing physical things. They're in trouble now economically, but I believe there's a wider pattern happening at the moment. And so gold, they're the only ones that see gold as a critical metal. And what I think there is the plan that they put on the ground, the military, the unrestricted warfare book is an evolution of the art of war in a modern conflict context. And war without rules is like an English guide to that. So you actually need both. But that was in 1999. And so this plan has been around for decades. This is the 100-year marathon. Part of that is to get out from under the petrodollar empire, as in to get out from under the fiat currency system. And to do that, they need lots of gold. And to a scale of, say, 50, 60 years, they've seen gold as a strategic element. They've been mining it and they've been buying it like there's no tomorrow. It's part of their plan. It's not by accident.
Right. But what they've been messaging for the for the last several years under BRICS is more of a multipolar world where they would where there would be no one currency, a global reserve currency like the dollar, to abuse its status, but it would be more so something that's spread across various nations, Russia, China, Iran. Go ahead.
That's the messaging. Agreed. Now, part of their strategy is it's all fine, it's all good. We're not a threat to you. We're just, we're benign. We're a peaceful, economic-loving nation. We're going towards democracy and free markets. We're all going to have a group hug. Trust us. Trust us. When really, in terms of who owns what, no matter what system of currency is there, they own all the industrial stuff. They also know and understand that the existing system is a fiat currency and is destined for a reset at some point. And this chart here in 2022, this was the raw materials that went into global manufacture. And they've got a controlling stake in almost all of it. Right, so they are only part of the way through their plan, but they're close enough to success that they're just unveiling now. So what I then did, this is what we should do. So this is the copper value chain. The beige box at the top is mining. Now, most of the time in the mineral intelligence world, we just look at what was mined in a particular year for copper, for each, and okay, so 20 million tons of copper content was mined. Sometimes we might look at it by nation state, and that's where it stops. Right, watch this for a game of soldiers. The next step is smelting. So China does a lot of smelting. They do mine copper domestically, but they also import a lot. How much gets imported? Some of it gets recycled from manufacturing. How much? How many smelters they got? So they're running between 100 and 120 copper smelters in China. So the rest of the world is between 11.4 and 11.9 million tons of copper cathodes, and 11.1 million tons are refined internally. Okay, the next part of the value chain, they're also importing copper cathodes from around the world too. How much? They've got between 1,500 and 2,000 factories making copper-based products and components. And this is how it's sort of split up. So these are the sorts of things they make. And all right, so this is the stuff they make. Then what happens? Come back here. About 10 to 15% gets exported, and the rest of it goes to Chinese domestic manufacturers. And this is the pertinent piece of information. When we're talking about critical raw materials, we are talking about perception of a supply shortage. But a supply of what? It's not copper that we're worried about. It's computers and mobile phones and electric vehicles and cars and white goods. And we don't make that stuff, we buy it. Where do we buy it? Nations around the world. China happens to control a lot of it. So when we're talking about copper, yeah, very, very important. The part of the value chain we're talking about is this, the stuff that comes out of manufacture. Where does this stuff, this is what we see in the market. The Chinese are sourcing their own manufacturing sector domestically, and then they'll sell us the outcome and we pay full price for it. They're playing the game magnificently. Now, the other thing to look at, in terms of getting something started, starting a mine is one thing, and starting a manufacturing business is another thing, like a relatively small footprint. But making a smelter is huge. The industrial, the size of these things is huge. The footprint is enormous. And it's so much harder to justify. You've got to justify where material comes from, and then you've got only a small number of clients. And so I believe the smelting part of the value chain controls everything else. And when we go back to this chart here, how much of the smelting of metal across all of these things, which the rest of the world sees as, critical, do they control? And the answer is a lot of it. And that is the elephant in the room that no one seems to be seeing. Now, to skip ahead, the next part here is money. Who controls the mining industry in terms of money? Right, and so these guys that we met have a way of mapping capital controls of companies. Let's do it. So I refer to this paper in 2011 by Zurich University, where they looked at who controls what. And so they took a database of about 30 million economic actors worldwide, and they picked, and from that they picked the 43,000 biggest. Who owns what and who interacts with what, and this is the outcome. Right, so there's what they call a bow tie structure.
Okay.
A little under 800 corporations directly control something like 80% of the corporations. Right, and 147 corporations, less than 1%, control 80% of the entire revenue. And then you've got a series of hedge funds on top of that, which they were you couldn't really track. What if we were to turn this analysis style using AI onto the Chinese industrial system? What might we find?
Okay.
And hasn't been done yet, but that's the next trick.
You got me excited there for a second.
We haven't done it yet, but this is what we're doing. And so I'm actually now going down the rabbit hole on all sectors in the Chinese economy, all the major metals, all the smelting, manufacturing, and if I can convince my management it's a good idea, it'll be a nasty report. So that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Where do you get the data from?
So what I would do is I've got contacts all over the world. So I'll ring up some contacts of mine in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and I'll say, right, where do I go to get good information in these areas? And they'll tell me that. Then I'll fire up ChatGPT, but the paid version, and says, using these data sources as a lead, answer these questions. So it starts with people to direct me what's good data sources, and there are things like the China Copper Association, the China Manufacturer Association. There's a whole series of industrial societies in each sector. There's one for copper, one for iron and steel. There's one for tin and that sort of thing. For the mining stuff, USGS is still pretty good, but the numbers can only sort of take you so far. And then you go to, well, what companies control the major sectors, and then you actually go to the actual annual report. And so you have a target year of, say, 2022, which was the last year of stable data, because even 2023 and 24 is not complete, and I don't think they ever will be if they're not by now. And you put it there. So everything has to be referenced to the point where, say, like a peer-reviewed paper, so every single number in this table is backed up. Show me the backup. And that's what I've sort of got to do there. But we've got to map things at that level, and we've got to do it for mining, smelting, components manufacture, but then we've got to do value chain to say white goods. What are the inputs that go into it, and what are the outputs, and where do they go? electronics, cars, batteries, textiles. When you actually look at the Chinese industrial sector, there's several industries that dominate, and there's not that many of them. So instead of mapping everything, map the big ones and just say, well, these trends are there. And
go ahead.
When we go to the finance stuff, the questions will be asked are, who controls each company of the big companies? Who controls the companies, and who has voting rights? And what are the offtake agreements for each operation? And so we'll have an estimate of control. And so back to the military strategies, instead of killing the enemy, controlling the enemy. That's their objective. So the American military has spent an absolute fortune on making their military most lethal as possible. Like the F-22 Raptor aircraft cost billions. But in terms of fifth generational warfare, where it's economic and information and cultural and psychological, the important battles have already been won and lost before a single aircraft is launched.
Mm.
And so the whole idea of spending a lot of money on a military strike aircraft like the F-22 is not sensible if that's not where the real battle is.
So what do you anticipate is the logical conclusion to all of this? Where are the roads taking us? Are we heading towards a China multipolar world? Will the United States, from a game theory perspective, how does the United States and the West respond to this?
Well, they are responding. So the plan that I see in China at the moment is not unusual. There's 7 or 8 big ones. Like, for example, the World Economic Forum had the Great Reset. That's a plan of a similar scale. You will own nothing. You'll have no privacy, and you'll be happy. It's the same basic idea as a relatively small group of people will control everything, not just in one little region, but most of the planet. Right? There have been lots of plans like this right across history, so they're actually not that unusual. What I see sort of happening is we may have a multipolar world for a while. If China is successful, it may be multipolar, but China will be the ultimate top of the food chain, and everyone else will dance to their tune because they control the economic and industrial infrastructure. Right? Especially if they're able to launch a currency that's backed with gold. Now, at the moment, that's not an idea that's going to work. They're still, the United States is still a massive infrastructure. So this is the idea of the 100 Years' War, where the Chinese will, over time, step by step, quietly, like a python constricting its prey, slowly move into position. Now, the target was 2049. They've got a lot of the infrastructure already. But if someone was to if you look at the data again, most of it was like smelting. If several nations around the world to make their own smelters, like their own aluminium and copper smelters, then the Chinese would lose control of their own plan. And so, well, they don't make smelters because they're not economic, because the Chinese make them more than anyone else. But if someone took a small fraction of their military budget and did that, well, okay. So I can see counter strategies coming forward. A 5th generation warfare strategy is based on waterfall architecture. That is, things have got to happen first in order. This happens, then that happens, then that happens. If the strategy is diagnosed too early, it's very vulnerable to disruption. So it happens in the dark, and deceit and deception are primary tools to protect it. And when you actually look at a lot of the Chinese strategies in terms of how they do things, deception and deceit are primary tools. Like the Western mistake is we are projecting ourselves onto them. They're like us. They want to be like us. Democracy is the best system, therefore they want it too. They think without ethics and morals because we're superior. That's our mentality when we look at them. And actually, they've got a history that goes back 5,000 years. And they said, well, we've seen lots of generations of this, and we've got our own way of doing things. Thank you very much. And the current paradigm is warfare. Like in the American War for Independence, Washington introduced guerrilla warfare against the line formations of the British, and the British couldn't cope with this new paradigm, and they lost. Right, so the military doctrine has changed, and now we're in an information warfare context, and the Chinese paradigm sees all Chinese citizens and all Chinese businesses as part of their armed forces in an unconventional, multi-dimensional warfare battle space. Right, and we don't understand any of that. Where's it going? So what I see at the moment, the American system is undergoing a metamorphosis. The previous president represented a faction, in a globalist faction, the World Economic Forum interest group. The business interest groups that sit behind the World Economic Forum, for example, they were an interest group. They had a plan, the Great Reset, which essentially was, I believe, a currency reset, and banks step in and take all assets that were collateral against all loans, and they would use that in terms of social control to initiate their next plan of how they do things. And it looks like a system that wasn't very nice for the average person on the ground. The Trump phenomena is Trump is the face of another faction that's come in and has swept in. The previous faction, I believe, were cooperating with the Chinese at some level. But there's so many examples of the previous administration had been penetrated by Chinese interests at so many levels, and that was accepted. At the same time, the United States and the entire fiat currency system is bankrupt. It is completely insolvent. It's been insolvent for a long time. They owe more money than they're worth. And was it last Friday they got downgraded from AAA to AA or something like that? That's the polite version. But so the American Western infrastructure has been engaging in dodgy practices as well that are also not very nice. There are no good guys. What I think is happening is what I call the Trump tariff tantrum, is a negotiation of bankruptcy, like negotiated bankruptcy, where they're going from one state to another, where they can reorder the system economically and socially, try and clean house before things get destroyed. And it's coming across as a very, very crazy and toxic environment to try and work in. Screams of fascism and how could you do this? And what I think is really happening is behind the system is the music has stopped. The music has stopped, and now they're trying to work out what do we do with a shortage of chairs. I think the Chinese system and plan was hoping to keep things going for a little longer, but the tariff tantrum might have disrupted the Chinese flow. So it's like running a marathon race, and we're in that race, but we don't know we're in their race. And 30 years ago, our opponents took off. That's the position we're in. And so what I think the American system is trying to do now is not so much win, but not lose. That's the best they could probably hope for, where they retreat behind their borders domestically, which is, they withdrew from Europe and all that, and they're going to restructure and rebuild their infrastructure very quickly, full value chain, domestically in the United States. Whereas, okay, China's going to encroach, like they're moving all over the world. They're all over Africa. They're all over South America. This is, the capital. How much capital controls? What do they own and control? And I think the Americans are trying to gain control of their own domestic territory again. Australia, for example, most of the natural resources are owned by foreign investment. And what is that foreign investment? Mostly Chinese and American. So, yeah, and so it's all about resources. What will happen? Well, that depends on a few things. Europe is talking about rolling out a cryptocurrency-like structure, the CBDIC, and they're talking about October this year. I don't know if they're actually going to do it, but that sounds to me like a currency reset. And at some point they have to do that because they're saturated with debt. On July 1st, if they do this, the American banking system has to be Basel III banking compliant. The Bank of International Settlements has had an agreement that was ratified in, I think it was 2023. It was 2022 is when it was agreed to, where all banking assets had to be, and bank accounts had to be gold backed, or backed with some sort of physical asset that was agreed upon. And I think they were starting to agree on things like oil. Oil in the ground could be one of those things. The true details of that, no, I don't think anyone really knows. But what that means is the fractional reserve banking system that's been operating since the formation of the Federal Reserve. 1913 they formed, and 1916 they actually went live. Right, well, January 1st, 2023, Basel III went live, and that's also when the Ukraine war kicked off. And the Ukraine war, I think, was about, will the BRICS dollar be allowed to survive, or will it be forced to the Anglo-American fiat currency systems run out of London? So it's money, it's resources, and it all seems to be going down now. So July 1st is the deadline for the American banking system to be compliant. Will they do it? I don't know. Remember, you got Trump, the wild card who excels at being badly behaved and snubbing his nose at everyone else as a negotiation tactic. I'll say something outrageous. I'll do something outrageous as a tactic to
throw your opponent off. Yeah, it throws your opponent off. It takes them off balance.
And people say it works. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you just said now makes perfect sense as to why there's this big push to get Greenland to all this talk about acquiring Canada, or maybe even Alberta and Saskatchewan becoming 51st, 52nd states, and then pretty much reviving the Monroe Doctrine, making the Western Hemisphere the top priority, the sphere of influence of the United States. Because what he's really trying to do is create a fortress on the Western Hemisphere to mitigate the threat that they see from China.
So they're not the only threat, though. So you've got there are multiple D states, and there are multiple factions around the world, and they're international. They're not actually attached to any particular country, and it's the mechanics of power. And in fact, to understand all of this, 48 Laws of Power.
I have that book.
Yeah. So it's human nature organized into systems.
Mm-hmm.
But
what do you make of the Europeans coming to the table with China to cut a trade deal with them as a response to the tariff, like you said, the tariff tantrum from Trump?
So the previous faction that was in control of the United States, remember, it's like Game of Thrones with different factions. It's not a country as such. It's a faction.
Right.
The previous faction dictated terms to Europe at large around the Ukraine war, says we cannot allow the Russians to prevail. That is, we can't let the ruble be a currency trading platform for a commodity like gas. That's not allowed. It must be ours. Right. And so Russia invades. What do? We hit them with sanctions. 2 days later, it was, oh, no sanctions. The deal's broken. Right. You will now pay for our gas in our rubles. If you don't want to do that, you don't get the gas. And then they says, well, we can't do that because our banking buddies won't let us do that. Therefore, we go to war. But whoever wins that war is winner takes all. So the United States steps in and tells Europe, dictates terms, you must take these actions for the survival of our banking system. And so Europe made a whole series of decisions that were not in their own best interest. Now, there's a lot of debate about why this is and why this should be.
But Putin also calls out. He also calls out the UK as the prime stakeholder behind the Ukraine war. Oftentimes, he'll mention the Anglo-American establishment as the culprits behind a lot of the chicanery going on there.
It was Boris Johnson that scotched the peace deal in 2022, because if there was a peace deal, the Russians would have prevailed. Right, and Europe, that was getting 75% of its gas from Russia, now had to actually cut that and get what gas it could from America, which cost 4 times as much, which also meant a lot of industrial businesses left Europe. Where do they go? America! Why? The Inflation Reduction Act was being written at the same time these sanctions were being encouraged. So Europe was asked to take one for the team by the previous faction. Okay, there was an election in America. There's a behind-the-scenes, battle of wills. A new faction comes in. The new faction says, "Nope, we're doing things differently now," and they're going to pack up and withdraw from Europe. And Europe says, "Hang on, but we've just destroyed ourselves for you." And say, well, sucks to be you. But there are no good guys. There is no honor. There are no long-standing friendships that people can depend upon each other at a nation-state level anymore. It's realpolitik, and I believe what's happening here is peak oil happened in 2018. 2018 November is the date at the moment, but since then the system's been under stress. Whether we can pull a rabbit out of the hat and exceed that peak again remains to be seen, but we are under a position of stress for the last couple of years. And that's what's going on here, I believe. And so we're moving into the new faction has sort of come in. Europe now finds itself abandoned by the Americans themselves. The Russians are now going to punish the Europeans, I believe, because this was ugly. This was not kicking the Russians out of the SWIFT system. All right, it's now weaponized.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things happening behind the scenes that really were not ethical. We are conditioned to believe how unethical the Russians are. And okay, they're Russians. Maybe that's true. But it also turns out we're not necessarily very good either. Realpolitik.
Yeah. Well, what's the nature of the Russia-China alliance? Because yes, you did have a more China-friendly previous administration here in America with the Democrats. Like you mentioned, they seem to be more aligned with China, but they did wage war against Russia through Ukraine, and Russia is an ally of China. So how do we make sense of that?
So this is the Chinese strategy. Don't go to war. Get someone else to go to war for you. I think the BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Why South Africa? They produce gold. Not very much gold, but they produce gold. Why are they there? I think the alliance was formed so those nation states could, through their commodities, get out from under control. The Western nations in general were exerting control on those nation states. And this is control of resources. They wanted to get out from under the Anglo-American banking empire and form their own. Now, the Chinese approach is softly, softly, we're not a problem until they are. The Russians, on the other hand, have a terrible reputation. They make any move at all, and yep, they're the bad guys. So they're already the bad guys. And so I believe that the BRICS alliance is actually, the Russians have taken on what they have is a strong military. They're not very big economically, but they've got a strong military. So if they were to use that military in a way, well, we're going to go and do this and you can't stop us, and we're going to force a particular outcome. And this is why the Chinese have been quietly supporting them. And in the UN, none of the BRICS nations have openly opposed the Russians. This is a chess match. So at the moment, I think it's an alliance. But once the West has been, neutralized in terms of the interests within the spheres of the BRICS nations, once it's been got to the point where the West is no longer exerting control over them, and we have been, to be frank, I think the Russians long-term have the same problem that everyone else does, and they've got to avoid being absorbed by the Chinese economic infrastructure.
Yeah, and they share a border too. Well, hey, Simon, I hate to cut things off short, but we do have a hard stop in about a minute or so. Thank you so much for coming on, as always, my friend. Where can people find you if they want to see more of your work?
So I've got a website. I haven't updated it recently, but I will. simonmichaux.com.
Excellent.
And I've put all of my reports up there.
We'll post a link to that down below. Can they find the purple transition in all of your papers and presentations there as well?
Some presentations on the podcasts are on the YouTubes on that website. The purple transition is documented in full in the Hawaii report in scenario HI and associated appendices.
Okay, I'll get in touch with you and just get all the links that to be shared, and we'll post it down in the description box down below. So check them out, guys, if you're interested. Like, subscribe, comment. Go, Simon, go in the comment section if you agreed with what we had to say today. If you disagreed, that's fine too, but let us know why. I do, in fact, read the comments. Yeah, so drop your thoughts down below. Agreed, disagreed, doesn't matter. It's all good. Also, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss an episode. It also helps us get this video and this channel out in the YouTube algorithm. And check me out on Substack, capitalcosm.substack.com. Get early access, ad-free version, uncensored versions of all of my content. With all that said, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.